Welcome, everyone.
Hello.
We'll go ahead and get started. There may be a couple people trickling in, but we're really excited to have you all here for the Early Math Symposium and for this session. Thank you so much for joining us, our presentation for supporting spatial thinking in early childhood. My name is Madhu Govind Kapoor. I'm here from West Ed.
My name is Sophie Sawakos. I'm also here from West Ed.
And in today's session, we'll introduce you to some ways that you can support spatial thinking in early childhood. In this presentation, we'll focus on primarily infants, toddlers, and preschool-aged children. And we'll first start by reviewing what spatial thinking is and how it develops in early childhood. And then we'll also address some ways that educators can support children in developing spatial thinking skills and concepts. And along the way, we have a couple of video examples of children actually engaging in spatial thinking and how the teachers in those contexts are supporting children in their learning. So as we go through these different video activities, feel free to share your ideas and questions here from the chat. I'm already seeing a couple of chats here. Please introduce yourself. We'd love to hear from you. The content that we are presenting here today is developed as part of the California Statewide Early Math Initiative, which has as its mission to improve math and science outcomes for children ages 0 to 8 across the state of California. This initiative is led by the Fresno County Superintendent of Schools, and the California Statewide Early Math Initiative, or as what we like to call CAEMI, is a collaboration between the AIM Center for Math and Science Education, West Ed, and the California State Board of Education. And as part of this initiative, we and other partners are developing a series of 10 online professional learning suites. These suites are designed for professional development providers, such as trainers, coaches, and administrators to support early childhood educators in early math. These suites not only aim to build the capacity of PD providers, but they also will support them with resources that they can then use in training and coaching with educators. So the content that we are presenting today is a part of one of these suites, but we are in the early phases of development. So please stay tuned with news about these suites in the future. So before we begin by telling you what spatial thinking is, we want to ask for your ideas about what you think this might be. So we'll start off first by showing you a short video of an infant classroom. In this video, you'll see infants exploring a variety of open-ended materials with their teacher, Christina. And as you watch this video, try to notice the types of math concepts that children are exploring here. And specifically, what are some examples of children exploring spatial thinking concepts or skills?
Okay, I'll start the video.
Would you like to join? So one of our current interest areas for our language-based learning theme right now is how objects fill up space and how our bodies move through space. Deegan's coming out. Azaria's coming out. We're already kind of geared towards choosing some core vocabulary that we're working on, which is inside, on, empty, and full. She's inside. The materials we had clearly tied into that because we were filling up and emptying and having a little chant that they're pretty familiar with. Inside, on, empty and full. Inside, on, empty and full. It kind of connects us to, yes, these words are meaningful. I'm filling up this basket and I'm dumping it out. You filling up your basket? Or you're sitting inside. Look at Yola sitting inside that little tub. That's funny. Yeah, he sat in a little tub. Sometimes we sit in the big tubs.
All right. So I'm seeing the chat popping up with people introducing themselves. Please continue to do that. And from the video that we just watched, if you noticed any examples of children exploring spatial thinking concepts and skills, what are some of those examples? Or maybe you noticed any spatial vocabulary being used. Go ahead and call those out. I noticed someone earlier say, "Do I fit in this box?" Yes, the teacher is asking the infants, "Am I big enough to fit in this box inside and out?"
Okay, I see someone mentioned the song. Yes, that's a great little way that the teacher is introducing spatial vocabulary through that song. I see the use of parallel language coming up. Yes, the teacher is describing what the children are doing, sort of as they are doing it.
A lot of vocabulary, so the location, direction, how those objects are moving, the trajectory of them. These are some great examples.
Yes, a lot of people are noticing that spatial vocabulary, that positional vocabulary. You see someone mention the inside and out or inside and on, empty and full. I also want to point out someone talked about getting inside that tray or that box and out of the tray. We didn't have the full clip here, but the children were really enamored with that idea of getting inside. And then they also have the white box that they put inside as well. So lots of exploration there. Yeah, children exploring their relationship to the concept of inside out. So I think maybe we'll move on to the next slide, but feel free if more ideas pop into your head, feel free to continue to write that down in the chat. They're really hearing some great examples here. Um, so next, I thought we'd get started with just defining what spatial thinking is to make sure that we are all on the same page, and then we'll go a little bit more into detail on how teachers can support this and also how children are developing these skills. So our way of defining spatial thinking here is skills in early childhoods that involve things like understanding the positions of objects in space, their relationship between objects in space, and also understanding how to navigate space. So these are all parts of that spatial thinking. Now, you might be wondering, why is spatial thinking important and how does this relate to early math? So spatial thinking skills are really critical for lifelong learning in all domains, but including areas in STEM. So STEM stands for science, technology, engineering, and math. So just to provide a few examples of how we might see spatial thinking interacting with these other STEM areas. If you think about science, for example, understanding how a bird moves through the sky, or visualizing the structure of molecules, these all require for us to have spatial visualization skills. When you think about engineering, a lot of children are engaging in engineering when they're building and working on engineering problems like building a castle or building a house or a bridge. And they need to think about how the objects and materials that they're using fit together, how different shapes fit together, how they might be rotated or flipped so that they fit together better and are able to build what they're hoping to build. And all of this requires their mental rotation skills. And then just thinking about other math skills. When children, for example, are comparing the lengths of two objects when they're thinking, when they're discovering measurement, they're using their spatial orientation skills to make sure the objects are aligned at one end so that they can compare their length. So these are just some examples of the ways that we really use spatial thinking in many different areas of life, specifically in STEM. And what we know from the research as well is that spatial thinking skills are not just important in early childhood, but they are really important for jobs in all STEM fields later on. So with that said, and now that we have sort of a combined understanding of what spatial thinking is and why it's important, We're going to briefly review in the next few slides how children develop skills in spatial thinking. And we'll be doing that by looking at 4 components, which are spatial orientation, spatial navigation, spatial vocabulary, and mental rotation. And specifically, our presentation today will focus how children are developing skills in these 4 areas or these 4 components when we're talking about infants, toddlers, and preschoolers. So let's get started with spatial orientation. So from the moment infants are born, they begin to develop an awareness of how their own body fits in space. So you will notice, like you saw in this video, infants trying to fit their body and other objects in containers or small or bigger spaces. They also begin to represent the position of different objects in space. They might notice the distance of these different objects from one another or the distance from this object to themselves. And you might notice, for example, that they have a mental representation of where their favorite toy is in their room. So they know where in the room, what spatial orientation in the room that toy is. So this is all part of infants learning spatial orientation skills. It's this understanding of how they themselves fit into space, how objects fit into space, and how these things all relate to one another. So let's just take a moment to think back to the video we watched earlier of the infants. When you have a second in the chat, can you recall some ways you noticed children, these infants specifically, developing their spatial orientation skills through their play? Share any ideas you have in the chat.
I'm seeing here someone pointed out another reason for why spatial thinking is important for young children as a safety issue. So that's definitely an important reason. These resources are, like we mentioned earlier, going to be part of that online suite. So they are still in the early stages of development. So while you might not see this exact PowerPoint shared with you, they are going to be a part of a whole suite of other resources where you will find access to this information. So thank you for that question.
We'll just give people some time to think about ways that infants might have been exploring spatial orientation in the video we watched earlier. Any ideas? Well, some of the ideas I can provide a few as people are typing, but children were exploring inside and outside, right? And they were thinking about their own body in space, and that when they were in that red container, they were also looking at other children in the containers. Yes, Amanda, I see you said the child climbing in the small tub and rolling out, right? Yeah, that's a great example of spatial orientation. Experimenting with the tubs, the tub inside the tub. Someone, I think Virginia mentioned, or Ginger mentioned that her or his littles like climbing in boxes, and they have a wire basket that they use to climb and read a book in. Yeah, the boxes, climbing in the containers, filling the baskets with toys is another great example. Understanding how these balls were fitting inside those containers. Yeah, these are all great examples. So we'll move on to the next component, but feel free to continue putting your ideas in the chat. So the next component is spatial navigation. So as infants and toddlers develop their motor skills and learn to crawl and eventually walk, they can observe objects from different perspectives. They will notice that an object looks quite different from different angles, right? And so as they're discovering these different perspectives and as they're using their new motor skills, they're also noticing how these different objects relate to one another in a space. This allows them to notice and remember important landmarks in their environment. So they get a sense of where, for example, big pieces of furniture are in a room, or when they are outside, they might notice a tree that's somewhere. And so starting in preschool, children continue to develop their spatial navigation skills through the mental maps of their environment that they're developing. So while infants and toddlers are keeping track of important landmarks, pre-kindergartners, they are developing mental maps of their environment. They also thinking about distance. So they might describe their toy as being close to the table but far from the lamp. And they become much more confident in navigating these familiar spaces and environments, and knowing how to move through a space to get to the toys or objects that they're interested in. And you will probably also notice that preschool children or pre-kindergarten children start to recognize and predict familiar routes that they walk or navigate a lot. So they might remember how to get to the park or how to walk from their house to the preschool that they go to. So these are all ways that children in early childhood are learning to navigate the space, the environment that they're in. And I'll pass it on to Madhu for the next two components.
Great, and I'm seeing some additional examples here in the chat of young children crawling under a lot of different types of furniture, and sometimes in ways that might surprise us of how did you get under there? So really exploring how their bodies fit through different spaces. So we've talked about spatial orientation and spatial navigation, and these are concepts that children develop even before they have the vocabulary to describe spatial locations and relationships. But as children start to develop their language skills, they start to build the vocabulary to describe their spatial relationships and locations. So spatial vocabulary falls in three broad categories. So there's words that describe position. So you see some examples here like on, in, over, under, behind, near, between. There's also words that describe the direction. So up, down, left, right, across, upside down. And then there's words that describe distance or how far an object might be. So near, far, long, farther, away. These are some examples of vocabulary that they might be using. And typically, children will develop their first spatial vocabulary between their first and second year of life. And words like up or in are among the first words that infants understand, while words like left and right, or words that might describe coordinates, are not words that develop until probably later in preschool and early elementary. So let's take a moment now to practice some spatial vocabulary. As we've been identifying some already in the videos, we can also think about how we use spatial vocabulary in our everyday life as adults. So I'd like to invite you for a short little exercise. So think about where you are currently in your space, where you're joining from, and how you might describe that location using spatial vocabulary. So for example, I am sitting in a chair inside my house, and you can see from my background behind me that there is a fake olive tree and a painting behind me. So I'm using the vocabulary of in, inside, behind. And if you can, share in the chat a phrase that represents your spatial location and try to use spatial vocabulary to describe maybe some of the things in your surroundings.
And I'll give it a go as well. So if I had to describe where I am, I'm inside this room next to a window, sitting on a chair. I might also describe that there's a bottle of water next to my desk, or on my desk next to my computer. On the floor, someone's on the floor. That's another way to...
Great example.
Children spend lots of time on the floor. Close to a window, yeah, you're describing your distance.
Light over my head, next to my printer. the table around my chairs.
Okay, I'm on the couch near a table but far away from the door. Lots of things coming in here. I'm on top of a chair in front of my computer that is located to the left of the main door. Yes, using left and right. We as adults have a tendency to use left and right a lot, but that's actually pretty difficult for children when they're young to understand their left from their right. In my room with the light from my window, which is far from where I'm sitting.
Next to my dog. I'm very jealous of that person.
Yes. Oh, in the sun too. Okay, some outdoor time. That's wonderful. Large desktop computer. And what I'm noticing too from the descriptions that people have put in the chat is you're using that positional vocabulary, that distance, that direction, but even some other mathematical vocabulary about size, for example, like a large glass door behind me, right? In a box for hiding from the children.
These are some great examples. Awesome. So we'll keep going, but as you start to notice in some of the video that we watched or the video that we're going to show in a little bit, see what kinds of vocabulary are coming up in the way that they talk about where the children are located or the objects that they're engaging with. So another important component of spatial thinking is the ability to visualize and mentally transform objects. And this is what's referred to as mental rotation. And mental rotation skills first develop in infancy as they start to explore and experiment with objects. So as they're holding, turning, dropping objects, someone mentioned that earlier in the chat, they start to notice that objects can be looked at from different perspectives. And in one study, researchers found that infants can learn that a toy animal, like a toy giraffe, looks different when it's turned around or turned upside down. And as children get a little bit older, so toddlers, they can continue to develop their mental rotation skills by not only experimenting with objects, but now do so with a goal-oriented way. And they might rely on a lot of trial and error to discover how things are moving and fitting in space. So for example, they might try to fit a puzzle piece into a puzzle board, and they may try different orientations and try to mentally rotate the objects to try to fit the puzzle piece in. Pre-kindergarten children rely less on trial and error, and as they become more skilled at predicting how objects move and fit in space. For example, if they're shown a picture of an elephant that's slightly rotated so that it's not in its typical standing position, many 4-year-olds can tell you which direction right or left and demonstrate with their bodies or their hands the way that the elephant would be facing if it were rotated back on its feet. So these are some examples that young children, from infants, toddlers, and younger pre-kindergarten children are starting to think about mental rotation and are exhibiting that through their actions and the way that they play with different objects. So now that we've reviewed some of the important components of spatial thinking, let's start to think about ways that educators can support children in developing these concepts and skills. So we'll now take a look at this video of preschool-aged children exploring spatial concepts in the block area of a classroom with teacher Ava. And pay particular attention to the way that this teacher asks questions and uses spatial vocabulary to support children's learning.
What should we start with? We have fish shapes, we have...
I got the bottom part.
Okay, the bottom part of the lighthouse. We're gonna build a foundation at the bottom.
The block area is a great area to incorporate math because we have the blocks of different sizes. You work geometry in there, you do special relationships, sizes, space, Can you fit one here, if you take one here, and just kind of expanding on that and letting them take the lead and me just following them and try to support their learning.
What else do we need to do, Mika? What else should we do? Okay. Do you want to leave this open, or should we add more pieces in the middle?
Trying to help prompt them to how can we bring the math into this area. So by doing that, by me asking those open-ended questions relating to math.
Okay, so we're adding these square blocks around, and in the middle we are going to put the rectangle blocks in the middle. Okay, is this our foundation now? Should we make the structure taller by making it go up? Should we make it?
We did talk about height, how tall can it be? We compared the sizes of the shapes of the blocks that we're using. There were some smaller rectangular blocks, longer ones, so definitely we had incorporated like measurements and sizes in there, the spatial relationships.
Mika's getting more blocks so we can make a wall and then the roof. What should we start with? We have.
All right, so in the chat, write down any examples that you noticed of how teacher Ava was supporting children in developing spatial skills and concepts. And I'll challenge you a little further by seeing if you can try to identify, is what you're noticing, is that an example of spatial orientation, spatial navigation, spatial vocabulary, or an example of mental rotation, perhaps?
Yes, I see a great example in the chat, or a great comment. Ava did use a lot of open-ended questions to help scaffold their ideas, and also use math vocabulary to model. It's a great point.
Yes, we see some examples of spatial vocabulary, around, in the middle, taller, spatial navigation of how they were navigating to fit the blocks to construct their creations.
Yes, how they could use more blocks to build with or add to their structure. Yeah. Taller, wider, inside, outside. Yeah, it seems like a lot of you have noticed the spatial vocabulary, and I also see someone mention the mental rotation or spatial navigation. And so knowing how to move the block to fit together with the other pieces.
And I think what's great about this video is it doesn't feel very prescribed, like the teacher is kind of teaching or lecturing about spatial vocabulary. It really comes about just through her natural noticing of what the children are engaging with, and then just using that vocabulary to kind of reinforce, this is something that you're already doing, now let's add some words to it.
Yeah, you may have also noticed, it was briefly mentioned in the clip, but the children are building what they call the lighthouse, which is actually the name of their school. So children are also here making that connection to something they know in their environment and trying to build that. So we'll move to the last portion of our presentation today. You've provided us with some great examples of how teacher Ava supported children's spatial skills and concepts. And what I want to present to you today is one framework that we have developed as part of these online suites to help educators think about and analyze different early math practices through a framework that we're calling the M to the 5th math practices. So M to the 5th is called that way because there's really 5 M's in this framework. materials and learning environment, meaningful math interactions, math discourse, multiple representations, and mutual learning. So these 5 components can help educators as they think about how to set up learning experiences for children that are mathematically rich, and then that allow them to continue to develop spatial thinking skills. I should say that we're using this framework today to think about how teachers might support children in their spatial thinking, but this can of course be applied to any math topic. It's not just specific to spatial thinking. So let's briefly review these components. So the first one being materials and learning environment. So this is really about creating a math-rich environment with objects and materials that are likely to promote mathematical exploration for children at all ages. So what this might look like is integrating math throughout the learning environment to allow for meaningful math during play, but also daily routines. It's also about providing access to open-ended and engaging materials that allow children to explore spatial relationships in ways that interest them. So thinking back to both of the clips that we watched today, you probably noticed that the children were playing with a variety of different materials. So of course, the preschoolers are mostly playing in the block area with a lot of different blocks, but the blocks were of different sizes. They had choices in the sizes and shapes of the blocks. And then of the infant video that we watched earlier, there were a lot of open-ended materials. So just containers and things to fill those containers with, like balls, and different sizes of containers as well. So the second M is meaningful math interactions. So for children to learn mathematical ideas and concepts, educators play a really important role in providing children with meaningful experiences where children can solve real-life math problems that are meaningful to the child. So what this might look like is nurturing children's inquiry and exploration of math ideas within the context of everyday routines, daily interactions, or play. This also looks like asking open-ended questions and prompts to engage children in that math learning and to have them pursue what they're curious about. So again, in the clip we just watched, as I mentioned, children were actually building the school that they are in. They're building the lighthouse, and Ava made that connection between what children were building and asked them why they were building it that way, and really allowed children to follow their interests and explore math in a meaningful way. The third component is math discourse, or math language is another way to phrase that. So I think a lot of you have pointed out the great spatial vocabulary that you heard both teachers use in the clips that we watched today. And language really is an integral part to math learning. And so educators will want to model and encourage the use of mathematically rich language and communication by introducing children to spatial vocabulary, both in the home language and in English. But this also means that inviting children to represent their understanding in ways that are different from language. So especially nonverbal children or children that are really young and may not be able to express their ideas verbally, there are other ways that they can also express their mathematical ideas, for example, by using concrete objects, drawings, or symbols. So again, I know you've all pointed out many examples of math discourse in these clips, but we saw Ava use a lot of spatial and also engineering vocabulary by saying things like foundation, bottom, tall, wall. So this is a way that she was describing what children were building. The fourth component is multiple representations. So children need many different opportunities to experience and explore spatial concepts. It can happen as part of children's play, but it can also happen as part of daily routines or in activities that a teacher has intentionally planned for the child. So it is important that educators think about planning a range of developmentally appropriate activities and learning experiences that promote this mathematical thinking in different ways, but of course meet the needs of each individual child. So for some children, exploring spatial thinking might involve them being outdoors and exploring spatial thinking outdoors, as you can see here. Others might prefer to draw about spatial ideas or make art that are have mathematical concepts in them. So, of course, in both of these clips, we saw one way that the teacher was allowing children to explore spatial ideas. But you can think about ways that Ava or Christina might provide new opportunities for exploration the next day. So Ava might strengthen children's spatial skills, for example, by offering an obstacle course outside for children to explore going on, over, under, and use again that mathematical vocabulary there. And then the last M here is mutual learning. And it's really important to think about learning as a mutual process. Children are not just learning from teachers or educators, but educators are learning from children as well. So educators will want to notice and observe children and notice their interests, their level of understanding of a concept, their level of understanding of different vocabulary, and also the types of vocabulary that children are using or the ways that they're expressing their ideas. So together, all this information allows educators to plan future learning experiences that really build on children's interests and their strengths and allow them to take that next step. So they might also want to think about things like, how can you integrate a child's home language, a child's culture into the learning environment in a way that's authentic to the child? So these are ways that you create these meaningful math interactions by learning from the child and with the child. So I know we quickly reviewed these 5 M's, but we hope that this is a helpful framework for you or for the educators that you work with in thinking about how you might support children in their mathematical learning. Of course, in this case, we're talking about spatial thinking, but as I mentioned, it can really apply to any area of math. So to briefly review what we talked about today and some of the main takeaways from today is that for children's learning and spatial thinking, educators may want to provide open-ended materials for children to manipulate and explore. So you saw a variety of materials in these videos as just some examples. They will want to use spatial vocabulary in children's home languages and in English. So especially for children that are multilingual learners, they can benefit from hearing spatial vocabulary in all their languages so that they can build those connections. Then of course, offering many ways for children to explore spatial concepts. So math isn't limited to a table or to the indoor space. Math can really happen anywhere and at any time. So think about ways that you can explore math outside. Maybe it's through an obstacle course. Maybe it's through building something outside. Or think about ways that math can happen in a larger group setting or in small groups or individually, or ways that it can happen at the art table and the block table or in dramatic play. And lastly, it's important that children are able to experience math in situations that are meaningful to them. So the best way to do this is to really allow them to think through and solve real life mathematical problems that they're faced with, and scaffolding them and helping them think through these problems. So this is the content that we had prepared for today, and I'll pass it back to Madhu.
Great. So I know we covered quite a bit, and it was really great to see here in the chat and all of the different activities that we did together, just the examples that you all have shared of activities that you've tried or things that you've noticed young children exploring and how that relates to spatial thinking. So it's been great to learn from you as much as you've been learning in this presentation. But to close out today's session, we'd like for you to share one thing in the chat that you learned today or a strategy that you hope to implement to either support children in spatial thinking if you're an educator, or if you serve in a different capacity as a facilitator. What's something that you might take away from this session that you're hoping to implement as part of your role as a facilitator? And if you have any questions for us too, we have a few minutes here for you to ask any questions about the materials that we presented today, or the online professional development suites that we shared at the beginning. We do have a couple of minutes, so please feel free to share them in the chat.
Someone mentioned earlier on that they really love observing children and seeing what they are thinking, and that's a great point. Sometimes children maybe can't communicate to us what they are thinking with words, but observing what they're exploring can tell us a lot about their interests or the math ideas that they're sort of grappling with.
Great. I'm seeing here that people really love to see the examples of narrating language and using more positional language, mental rotation.
The idea of narration is really great, or someone I think mentioned parallel talk before. Children, especially infants, are probably not expressing their mathematical ideas, but describing what children are doing is a great way to introduce some of that important vocabulary.
And several people mentioned earlier this idea of learning through play, and how that the different materials that we might be using, the asking open-ended questions, all of that can happen in the context of play and making spatial thinking not something that feels like something you have to teach, but comes about in the ways that they're already just exploring their surroundings.
Yeah, since Amanda added to this idea of play. Michelle, you said that you were really like this idea of meaningful problem solving related to their environment. That's a really great one. How to make spatial awareness visible in all areas of the classroom, I'm hearing. Yeah, someone asked about the math online suites and how you will be able to access them in the future. So they will be publicly accessible suites, where the exact website is still up in the air a little bit. We don't know exactly where it will be housed yet, but it will be publicly accessible once they are finalized. But as we mentioned, they are still in the fairly early stages, and this is just one example of some of the materials we'll be providing, so PowerPoints like this one.
Yep. And in addition to PowerPoints, those materials will include activities that you can either do with children or with adults, handouts, reflection activities. So those resources are intended to provide a variety of different ways that you can think about spatial thinking and geometry.
I see a lot of people talking about the spatial vocabulary or the spatial language. Yeah, outside is such a fun way to get children involved in that spatial vocabulary.
Taking time to go through the thinking part, it's a great strategy and tool, especially when children are doing something and they may not necessarily know what they're doing, but taking the time as the adult to kind of slow down their process, bring in that spatial vocabulary and help them think through, oh, how are we going to fit this into this object? Or how are we going to solve this problem that we have? And the adult really has the role there to scaffold that learning.
So yeah, Rima, I see you asked about the m to the fifth. That is also going to be one of the core pieces of work that will be part of this suite, but also actually many of the other suites that we're developing that will be on different math topics. So not yet, we don't have a link to it yet, but it's coming and it'll be there soon. So I know we're coming up to the end of our time, I believe. So we just wanted to thank you all so much for attending today's session. And we hope you enjoy the rest of this symposium and get to experience some of the other great talks that are here today.
Agreed. Thank you all so much for joining, and please stay tuned. We do have a lot of exciting updates happening with the California Early Math Initiative, and we hope that you continue to follow along and explore some of the resources that we're currently developing and hope to release fairly soon.
Okay. Bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone.